This is another iRaw podcast.
Welcome to Wildly Unplug, sharing stories of nature, conservation, and creativity. Discover what develops when you unplug and step outdoors. Tabitha, thank you so much for being here today.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
You've got lots of cool stuff going on. I want to talk about where you are right now in a minute. Before we get to that, tell us a little bit about your journey to where you got to right now.
So I am a licensed counselor and I have a group practice with offices in North Carolina and Texas. And I started 10 years ago. This is actually our 10th year, which is very exciting. And started off as a teeny tiny little mental health organization who specializes in trauma with a focus on domestic abuse, because not a lot of people understand it and we find that it needs to be understood. So we help both victims and perpetrators heal, hopefully. Perpetrators are a little less exciting. They don't want to heal as much. They're pretty happy doing things that get them what they want. We really do try to help them, and we help churches understand domestic abuse and handle it properly in a lot of ways. So that's the big picture of what I do. And how I got here and with you is a big love of nature. It's something that we involve a lot in our therapy. I really believe, and the research shows that it's incredibly healing. There's research that says just 20 minutes a day in nature is more effective than pharmaceutical antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. And I'm like, we have this beautiful and amazing world, and we should be out in it and we should be caring for it. And so learning to care for ourselves helps us steward the resources in addition. So it's got a lot of layers to it in what we do. So I love that. We take clients out into the woods regularly and hike with them. You alluded to it earlier, but I'm sitting at a horse barn right now as we record this in my van, and we are doing some work with horses this morning. So that's really fun as well.
Very cool. So did you always have this aspiration to work with trauma patients and help them heal? What inspires you? Because it seems like it would be a pretty difficult job to deal with day in and day out.
It really has been my heart since I was about 13. I had a really difficult upbringing and difficult home situation. A lot of my friends did as well. And I remember thinking, if we had just one adult that would hear us and see us and be with us, maybe it wouldn't be so hard. Maybe it would be a little bit better. And I think recent research, like through the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, shows that in a home where there's a lot of difficulty, one buffer adult can actually help the child not have later health issues. Because when you have a lot of ACE events, which are things like mental health issues in your family, abuse, things like that, your likelihood of developing chronic illness later is extremely high. And I see that in our clients who've been in chronically traumatic situations for a long time, are showing up with autoimmune disorders and all kinds of things. And so I, in my heart, knew if we just had one person, and I was like, I can go be that one person. And so that was what got me here. God, who's merciful to me, was slow to let me do that work. I needed to do some healing myself, which I didn't know at the time. So I ended up in a whole different career in clinical pharmaceutical research for 22 years before transitioning into the therapy space. But I was enamored by the world itself. I was very fortunate to be sent all over the world to work, and I was able to see beauty in everything, in every place, and be in the woods in multiple countries and all kinds of things. And so I knew when I started my practice, there had to be that element for healing, and we had to include it for our people. And I've seen it just do spades. And so when I was able to finally go get my master's and get licensed and all of that, then it's been a really cool, wild ride.
Now, personally, I have a question for someone that works in this field, because I had to find my son a therapist years ago. We were going through a hard time. And when I was shopping around for someone to talk to, we were on a month wait list. And by that time, it's too late. Like, we need to talk to someone right now. What are some steps that we can take to be proactive in that? Because nobody ever really thinks they're going to need to talk to somebody until something happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really normal situation. Unfortunately, there's just not enough good care out there, and not all therapists are created equal. Unfortunately, there are some bad apples in the bunch, which is a real bummer. But I think sometimes I encourage people, think about it like preventive medicine. So get established with somebody before your hair is on fire, and somebody that you vibe with, because that's really the most important thing that can help you take a look at your life. And so if you're in that place, then you've already got somebody when it all hits the fan. You can just, and a lot of times we think, oh, I have to be going weekly. And you do if there's something going on. But if you're just, hey, I need to touch base once a month, a lot of therapists will do that. But when there's something big going on, call around and talk to lots of therapists and see who can get you in that is a good fit for you. And ask your friends, who do you see? Do you like them? What don't you like about them? What do you think could be better in a session? And asking a therapist, do you have any experience with this stuff? When we find, particularly with abuse, a lot of therapists will be like, oh, I'm trauma informed. And they took one trauma course like at some point in their career. And I'm like, no, that is not trauma informed. What trauma is, but you don't know how to treat it. And that's a very different state of affairs. You need to be really good at it, because otherwise you hurt people, and you don't want to hurt people who are already hurt. That's a terrible idea. I think having someone that you can just have a rhythm with, and also calling around. Don't be afraid to go to like an introductory session with someone and be like, yeah, this isn't a fit. Any good therapist is not going to be offended by that. If you're like, hey, you're not a fit for me, hopefully they will recognize it and say, hey, I don't think I'm the best person for you, but I know somebody who might be. Ask them if they have immediate openings. Say, hey, there's some big stuff going on. We need sooner than later. Could you let us know if you get a cancellation? There's a lot of things that you can ask. And sometimes people just don't know to ask them. And it is unfortunately really hard sometimes to get into a good therapist, because they are often very busy.
Unfortunately, yeah, the better they are, the busier they're going to be.
Yeah.
Are there some small steps that someone can take that's listening, maybe going out into nature, that help them heal a little bit through some trauma?
Absolutely. One of my favorite things on earth to do is forest bathing. And this does not mean getting naked in the woods. So I'll just preface it that way, because a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? And it comes from a Japanese practice that I think is just super great. And it's going out into the woods and using your five senses to be in the present moment, using sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste. Now, please do not go licking tree bark. That's weird. But you could take out, what we've done is take tea out, like a hot tea that you can enjoy in the woods that is like vibey with whatever you're doing. So maybe in the summer, you would take like a beautiful hibiscus chamomile tea out with you that is, and it can be iced if you're in the South because it's hot. Go out and you can enjoy that. And so when we're using sight, we're looking around. What do we see in nature? Can you notice a small critter? Can you notice the leaves? Can you notice the different patterns in tree bark? One of the times I did that, they had just done a controlled burn to support the forest floor. And it was really interesting because you could see the life coming back. So you saw the black earth, but then you saw the shoots of green popping up. And there's so much meaning in that of, yes, sometimes we feel like we are scorched earth, but new growth comes. And so there's a lot to be said in that. And so you can journal about your experience while you're out there. And then what are you able to touch? What does it feel like if you touch a birch tree versus a pine tree? What do you notice about the bark, about the texture? What do you notice about, now be careful which plants you touch. Poison ivy is not a good time for most people. So do actually know what your plants are. So if you're not sure, don't touch it. But what kinds of things can you touch and notice? And again, being mindful of leave no trace, right? We take only memories and we don't take anything else with us when we leave the forest, but just really noticing things. If you're at a beach, what is the texture of the sand where you are? Are there lots of shells in it? Do you see hermit crabs running around? Those kinds of things are things that you can take in. And then smell. What does the air smell like? Is the air moving or is it still? Does it smell different if there's a gust of wind or when it's still? Like, these are things that we don't think about a lot, but you can go out and think about. And then when you do taste, you can bring a snack, you can bring tea, you can bring something that supports that. Now, if you want to make pine needle tea, again, be mindful of your pine needles. I hear that's probably not good for you. Be careful. And but again, I support bringing food into the forest and not making the forest your food unless you know what you're doing. Those are things that you can do, that you can just, how does it feel in your body to drink a chamomile hibiscus tea in the woods or on the beach or wherever you find your nature, on the side of a mountain, in a mountain lake next to a spring? What does that look like for you? What do you notice? And if you notice tension when you came in, And this whole thing can take all of 20 minutes. You don't have to do this forever unless you want to. What do you notice in your body? Have you noticed areas of tension deplete? What are you noticing your mind's doing? And if you find yourself going to the challenges of the day or difficult thoughts or any of those things, it's okay. That's what our minds do. Gently and without judgment, just bring yourself back to where you are and start noticing again. And those are little things that are super accessible that people can do that don't cost a ton of money and don't cost a ton of time, but really have big benefits in our body and soul.
So glad that you brought up force bathing for one, because not a lot of people talk about it, and it's so great. It's something that people have been doing for centuries, and just because it has a hippy dippy term to it, people are like, no, but it's so many great benefits. And I was teaching a nature journal class with a bunch of kids, and we were doing senses out in the forest. And the one kid got to taste, and he's, oh, what am I going to eat? And I'm like, oh gosh, no, we're not eating anything out here. So bring a snack. That is excellent advice, because I don't want anybody eating anything they shouldn't be when they're out there.
No, leave the mushroom foraging to people who have like the knowledge of the mushroom foraging.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some long-term goals that you hope to accomplish?
One of them is to teach people that you need to take those moments of rest and you need to take those moments for true self-care. And self-care is different than self-indulgence, right? We can self-indulge sometimes, and that's wonderful, but true self-care is really a practice where we are caring well for ourselves, putting our oxygen mask on so we can love ourselves and others well. And so my hope is that people will embrace the outdoors. And look, I am a fluffy hiker. For those listening on audio, you won't be able to see me, but I'm a plus size girly. I am team sloth. I will get there when I get there. I will be bright red when I get there, and I will probably be breathing hard. But nature is accessible no matter your size. And I think that is something, especially people who are larger tend to feel like, oh, I'm excluded. And you're really not. You're really not. And I think it brings so many good benefits for not only our body and mind and soul, that there's so much good that can come of it. And I want people to embrace that. We get so into the daily grind and so into how our kids are doing, our spouse is doing, our friends are doing, and we forget to ask, how am I doing? Until someone's like, dude, you need to go to therapy. And we're like, oh, I guess I'm not okay. Honestly, I'd love to work myself out of a job, to be honest with you. I'd love people to be so amazing they don't need me.
That's a great attitude to have about it. I love it. Do you recommend, maybe this is going to sound maybe weird, like scheduling time to check in with yourself? Because you're right. People will forget otherwise. We're so busy these days.
Absolutely. I think it's a lot of times, if it's not on your calendar, it isn't getting done. And there's nothing wrong with setting aside time for you. And I think some people, especially people in like stricter religious upbringings, you get a lot of messages about you have to be selfless. And that's not exactly correct. If we, especially with, and I'm just going to use a Bible passage because I think it's one that gets a little trippy for some people, is like the love of self is often vilified, but Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, which is meaning you have to love yourself and take care of yourself, because how can you give to someone else if you don't have anything to give? And I think really getting into that place for people and being intentional, right? We don't, ideally, if we're doing relationship well, we are intentional with our people, right? We are spending time with them. We are thinking about their needs and wants and what they love. And we should do that for us. And so we can totally put that on a calendar. And I, a lot of times, will tell my clients, set a reminder, put it on your calendar, and then tell yourself in your mind, nothing shall tear me away. Because sometimes when it's even for ourselves, we're like, oh, I'll silence that alarm or dismiss the reminder. And it's really important that we don't, because we are as worth caring for as our spouse, our kids, our friends. And again, if we don't care for ourselves, how do we give to anyone else?
Exactly. Can you explain a little bit more about equine therapy? Because I want to head over right now and go play with some horses.
Oh my gosh, it is so fun. And so horses are so honest. And one of the things that I've heard for years from my equine therapist friends are, you get as good as you give. So what you give to the horses, you get back, essentially. And horses are an excellent judge of character. and they will pick you. So I've been in pastures with multiple horses, and one invariably will be the one that wanders over to me, and then one to my client, and all of that. And horses just have a way of knowing what you need and knowing how to comfort and how to challenge. There's a lot of leadership involved, because if you're leading a horse by a bridle, you're telling them where to go, but like the way you do it matters. I was doing a client intensive, and we were at our barn in Texas, and I loved the explanation of, you're going to hold the lead with some slack. You don't need to drag the horse, but you do need to direct them. And that's a little bit of an art, right? And that's such a good thing, especially for the voice of a woman. I think sometimes we don't know how to ask for what we need in a way that's going to help us get there. And I've seen women who have lost their voice in abusive situations regain it working with horses. And just having those moments of, oh, if I lead, if I use my voice, if I say it with authority, the horse will come and they will respect me, and then they'll snuggle up to me. And even better, who doesn't want to snuggle with a horse? And it talks about, you learn limits and boundaries. When I've taken abusive men out, there's a donkey that we use for them, because it's an obstinate little animal, and that donkey doesn't respect you, like you're getting nothing. And that's a really good way to learn how to relinquish your power if you have been too focused on keeping it, if you will. And that's been a lot of fun. So there's so many things you can do with horses that just open people up. And a lot of times, especially for teenagers, it can be easier to talk to a horse while your therapist is standing around than it is to talk to your therapist. And so we just want to give opportunity for openness wherever we can.
Humans are creatures of habit, and having the opportunity to practice using your voice in that space with an animal that's a little bit less, I guess horses could be intimidating to people. For somebody that has had trauma with a person, dealing with a horse might be a little bit easier to practice on to regain the voice. That sounds amazing. I've also heard, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, because I have a teenage boy, I find if we're walking the dog and he's standing next to me, the floodgates open and he's talking to me about everything. But if we're like at dinner and we're face to face, how was school? Fine. What'd you do? Stuff. And is it something about being outside, moving around, and being side by side that's a little bit different than the face to face?
Yes, especially for teenagers, they tend to work better in parallel than face to face. And we do a lot of walk and talk therapy with our clients, where we'll just go for a walk around our building or go for a walk in the woods or whatever. And that seems to work a lot better. I think they're used to adults talking at them, and they're in a place where they're trying to figure themselves out, figure out their life, figure out peer relationships. If you can go back and remember what it was like to be a teenager, most of us are like, that was really hard. There's all these hormones, and then mom and dad have things they want to say to you, or your caregivers have things they want to say to you. And you're like, I don't even know if I believe what you're saying to me, because of course they think they know all the things. But when we get them in parallel and give it that open space, you hear all kinds of stuff. That, and also at 11:30 p.m., because that I think is when every teenager wants to have deep, meaningful conversations, is like when you're really tired. So I would say in nature, in parallel, and also in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and I didn't think about, even for adults, walking with the therapist. I've done my fair share of talking to therapists, and being in a sterile room, it's uncomfortable, and it doesn't feel like a safe space for me. Maybe it is for the therapist. Being out in nature feels a little bit more at home and comfortable. So that might be something I'm looking into, is finding a therapist for just that goes walking around. Is there, when you're shopping around for a therapist, is that a credential that you guys list? This is my style of therapy, or is that something you just have to ask when you're looking around?
I think you have to ask. Some people will advertise it. It's a little less common in more rural areas, like you just don't hear it as much. But I think if you ask a therapist, hey, are you willing to do this? Some will say, no, that's weird, and my liability insurance doesn't cover it, but they can always ask their liability insurance. We did. Some therapists will be like, yeah, that's amazing, we can totally do that. And I think it's a little bit more of an emerging modality to walk with clients and to be outside with clients. There's concerns, obviously, in more metropolitan areas of privacy and all of that stuff. So my clients and I just talk about it. If we're going to go to a local park, you might know some people. What do you want to say? Because I take their lead. What do you want to say about it? Who do you want to say I am to you? I've been introduced in a variety of different ways, like my friend, this person I know, I just met her and I started talking to her, whatever. But like, how do they want to handle it? And I tend to pick places for my clients I know aren't going to be super busy on the day that we're going, but there's still always a possibility. And so just talking through those issues, and also mobility issues. I have clients that for some, they're not going to scale the side of a mountain with me because they can't, but they can do a flat path. So does it need to be paved? Does it need to be wooded? What does that look like for them? And is there something like that around for you? And so those are things that I tend to ask my clients. And I also encourage them, check with your doctor because we will be moving our body. There is risk involved, and just make sure that's a good fit for them.
In your experience, why do you think that nature is so healing?
I'm going to come at it from a faith-based perspective because that's my center, but I think that God created goodness and he knew what he was doing. And I think that he created us to be in that space. Originally, man and woman were created in a garden, and I think that was intentional. And I think we've gotten away from that with the Industrial Revolution and didn't know what we lost. And I think when we get out there, there's just space to breathe. There's not the hustle, there's not the hurry, there's not the pressure. Sometimes there's not a cell signal, which for some people gets a little freaky. But look, I always carry a satellite communicator because I am the girl that will get lost. But for a lot of people, taking that time to truly disconnect is really important, and we forget that it is important. And so I think that's one of the ways that nature helps us reset. Plus, like, there are chemicals the trees give off, like pine trees in particular, that is like healing, anti-inflammatory. There's all these good things for our body out there in nature, and we don't have to lick trees to get them. We just have to breathe air.
And that's super easy. We do that without thinking, most of us.
Exactly. Hopefully.
Yeah.
If we're not, then that's a whole pickle in itself.
Yes. Do you think that there are places outdoors that are better than others, like maybe by water or by trees, or do you think that it depends on the person and what they're going through?
I think it really depends on the person and what's accessible to you. I know for some people, if there are financial struggles, getting out to the Rockies, for example, would be a problem. I have the worst altitude sickness of ever. So if I go above 5,000 feet, like in an arid climate, the likelihood of me ending up in the hospital is rather high. So I just don't go those places. But I think you have to try a few things and see what feels good to you. Most people tend to like being near water. So if there's a lake or a pond or a stream or a river that you can be near, that's great. But it doesn't have to be that way. And for some people, they're like, I'm not a woodsy person, but I really love the beach. And if you have access to get to a beach, then do that. So it really just depends on you. But I would say any is better than none. So if your only option is Central Park because you're in New York City, take it. Take it and find a place that's maybe a little more alone, a little more closed off from the big city, and take what you can get. And sometimes we have to just give ourselves that invitation, particularly for traumatized individuals. They get into black and white thinking where it's all or nothing. And that's actually a really big healing thing for folks to go, wait a second, I can do enough, and to take a little when you can. And then if you have the opportunity to do more at a different point where you have the opportunity to maybe get out of a big city and get into the country, then do that.
So what's your favorite place outdoors?
My favorite place is next to a mountain stream whenever possible. But my very favorite place on earth is the top of Max Patch Bald in Western North Carolina. It is the most beautiful place I have ever seen. It's a pretty easy hike up. The road to get to the parking lot's a little extra, depending on your vehicle, because it is a single lane mountain road. And you're like, if I go too far to the right, bad things will happen. I've gotten up there in a variety of vehicles and it was fine. But when you get to the top of the mountain on a clear day, you can see a 360-degree view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it is the most stunning thing. And it is the most beautiful, peaceful thing. I've laid in the grass on the top of that mountain more times than I can count. And I absolutely love it.
I'm going to Cades Cove next week. So you're getting me all excited to go to see the mountains.
Love it.
That's, if I can't be at the beach, the mountains are definitely my happy place for sure. Do you have a favorite memory in nature?
I would say probably also Max Patch. I had been at the point a number of years ago thinking, I'm too fat to be in nature. What is wrong with me? And I connected with a YouTuber who had hiked the Appalachian Trail. She had done the whole thing from Georgia to Maine. And she was like, man, I saw plus size people on the trail all the time. I'm like, what? And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to give it a try. And so one August day, I had heard that Max Patch was beautiful, and I was like, okay, I think I can do it. And I remember getting to the top of that mountain and putting my hand on the white blaze of Appalachian Trail and just crying because I had not believed I could, and I did. And the beautiful thing about the hiking community is they're so dang supportive. And there were other hikers who were like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yes, it's like my first mountain I've ever summited." And they were like cheering for me and so encouraging. And it was so great. And so I think that is my favorite memory of any nature thing is knowing that you can when you didn't think you could. And I think that's why I like to tell people about it because we give ourselves limits that are often not realistic. Like we set these bars and say, I'm not really doing a thing if if I'm not at the top of Mount Whitney or something, which would actually kill me because it's like 14,000 feet. But sometimes we can just try. And even if I had never made it to the top, knowing that I tried would have actually been enough. And I think that's one of the things I want to communicate is we can oftentimes do more than we think. And even if we can't do it the way we want to do it, it's still good.
You still got to get there one step at a time.
Yep.
You can't focus on the whole thing, just one foot in front of the other.
Yep.
I mean, that helps me for sure. You've got a book coming out this year, right? In 2025. Gosh, I can't believe.
I know.
2025.
It's wild. Yes, I do. It is called Body and Soul Healed and Whole, an invitational guide to healthy sexuality after trauma, abuse, and coercive control. And it is for Christian women in particular, because I think the church doesn't talk about sexuality nearly enough and sex. And especially if you're a single woman, they don't. And I have seen it sexual harm ravage women in terrible ways, and purity culture ravage women in terrible ways. And they need not having distorted views and healing from just wickedness that was done to them. There's some really high stats. 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. And that number honestly is pretty low. My son, who's 19, told me when he graduated from high school, and we were talking about this, that he said, "Mom, I don't know a single female who hasn't been assaulted in some way." And that's heartbreaking. And it should not be that way. And the church should absolutely be talking about it and helping people heal. I feel like that's like literally their job. And so this book hopefully will help people get there and help people talk about the hard things, because it is very direct on a lot of big topics and a lot of really deep harm that women I have worked with have experienced. And hopefully it will help them let go of shame and step into a healing place, and also learn what healthy sexuality even looks like from a beautiful place. And this is not legalistic or preachy, because that is not my vibe at all, but it's honest and tender and invitational.
Very good. How can people find you?
They can find me at either tabithawestbrook.com or at thejourneyandtheprocess.com. And you need to spell out and to get there properly.
And before we go, what is one tip you have for someone that wants to connect with nature?
Do it. Schedule time and do it. And don't worry about perfection. I always tell my clients, progress, not perfection. You will get there. Even if it's, okay, I drove to the park and I walked onto a trail and that's all I could do today. You did it. You did it. So just start. And I think especially for single women, and especially for older single women, because I'm getting to that space myself these days, especially when you've been divorced, you feel like I can't do things alone. Yes, you can. You sure can. And so you don't have to go big. You can just go little, and it's enough. And like those little steps lead to bigger steps. My first steps were, can I climb this mountain? And now I'm literally sitting here talking to you from a camper van at a horse ranch. So there's that. And that didn't happen overnight. That was like years of trying different things and like expanding my horizons, and some really big fails that now are great stories.
Great advice. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Tabitha.
Thank you for having me.
And until next time, get outside and see what develops. Wildly Unplugged podcast is a production of Wild Development Studio. The views, opinions, and statements expressed by individuals during Wild Development Studio's productions do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Wild Development Studio or its affiliates. Participation in any activities, expeditions, or adventures discussed or promoted during our content may involve inherent risks. It is strongly advised that individuals conduct thorough research, seek seek professional guidance, and take all necessary precautions before engaging in such activities or venturing into wilderness areas. Wild Development Studio, its representatives, or employees shall not be held responsible for any injury, loss, damage, accident, or unforeseen incident that may occur as a result of participating in activities inspired by or discussed in our content. By choosing to engage with our content or act upon any information provided, individuals do so at their own risk and discretion.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.